All right, I think we can start. Okay, well, welcome everyone. And here we are at the final panel of the conference, which is titled Religious Authority, Affect and Solidarity in South Asian Publics, and promises to be every bit as enthralling as the earlier panels. I will introduce our moderator, Dr. Scott Kugler. Dr. Scott Kugler teaches about Islam in South Asia, comparative religion, Islamic ethics, and issues of gender and sexuality. He's the author of 8 books and numerous articles, including Sufis and Saints' Bodies, Mysticism, Corporeality, and Sacred Power in Islamic Culture from UNC Press in 2007, and Homosexuality in Islam, Critical Reflection on Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Muslims, 2010. His research languages are Arabic, Urdu, and Persian. Scott, the floor is yours. And as I mentioned, that I know we have an extra panelist compared to the other panels. So it's Friday afternoon. I will keep my closing remarks at the end very brief, so we can use most of the time for those allocated for those closing remarks, just so that everyone gets enough time and we have enough time for questions and answers. Thanks.
Very good. Welcome, everybody. And because of that bit of a time pressure, what I'm going to do is with each of our speakers is maybe at 10 minutes, give you an oral indication that we're at 10 minutes, and then you've got like a minute or two to finish up from there before we really have to stop and move on to the next speaker. So apologies in advance for being a chronologist. Sorry. All right. The other thing I thought we would do is I'll introduce each speaker just before they speak, rather than all in the beginning, so that some audience members, as they join late, won't miss your introduction. Okay, so with that, we'll begin with Narayana Ravat, and he's an associate professor of history at the University of Delaware. He's currently a member of the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, which is great. We're hoping there's a lot of fruitful work coming out of that. There, he is completing a book manuscript called The Language of Liberalism, the Dalit Public Sphere in Late British India. The book will intervene in the debates on liberalism and empire by introducing uniquely Hindi liberal concepts created by Dalit poet activists to interpret core ideas relating to representative government. So with that, Professor Ravat, please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Rohit. So what I'm presenting today is, can I pull up my screen? Just give me a minute, yeah? Can people see the screen? So can you see the screen? Can somebody, yeah? Yeah, okay, so what I'm presenting today is kind of an offshoot from my ongoing book. It's called The Sant Mat and Raidas, The Rise of Dalit Religious Publics in Early 20th Century North India. And I'm going to talk a bit about Sant Mat. So in this audience, most of us have heard about Sant Mat in several contexts. I first read about Sant Mat in Nambar Singh's 1982 milestone study, on the radical religious cultural moorings of the people, that the North Indian people that had distinct Brahmin roots. And then, of course, there's Purushottam Agrawal's 2009 book, Akhat Kahani Prem Ki on Kabir. And of course, the first book that you might be familiar with is Hajari Prasad Dwivedi's Hindi Sahitya Ki Bhumika. So there's the Hindi literary that has produced a fair bit of material on the idea of Sant Mat. And then you have the religious studies, people who have produced quite substantial amount in this field. Of course, the most famous is Catherine Scomer and W.H. MacLeod's The Sons. And since then, there's been a large corpus of religious studies, scholars who've produced a fair bit of material on Sant Mat. And the most distinctive, I think, the contribution to religious studies is in the field, religious studies field is in recovering and translating a large corpus of hagiographies, of Anantadas, Dadu Dayal, Nabadas, and a number of other traditions And that has been very fruitful to me to be able to write and engage in this debate on what is Santmat and the relationship of Raidas in this religious practice. So what I'm going to suggest to you guys is that what we have is a uniquely Dalit history of Santmat that has existed in 20th century North India. And that is only the last 20 years that has become available in the public domain with the entry of Dalit writers in Hindi. On the other hand, one can also say that the Hindi writers, whether it is Purushottam Agarwal or Namvar Singh, they've really not talked about the Dalits' intervention in Santmat and their relationship with Raidas. So I'm going to bring here what I think is, I'm going to offer you what I think is a Dalit literary history of Santmat that I would argue, and what I'll do in this presentation is to illustrate with few examples of Dalit literary engagement with Santmat religion that I would argue emerged in the 1910 and 1920s. And which you might also find it interesting because much of the study and discussion on Santmat and Raidas come from, at least in the religious studies, from Guru Bani and other Sikh religious sources. But this actually takes the history of Kabir and Raidas and Santmat really up in the early 20th century, which actually provides an interesting window to understanding the role of Dalits in this domain. I mean, today we associate Raidas and Kabir and the Raidasya movement in Punjab as a more recent development, right? I mean, and also the emergence of the Raidas temple in Banaras. But what we have here, as I'm going to suggest, is a much longer history of Dalit engagement with Santmat and Raidas. So what I'm going to do here is, as I said, illustrate with few examples. And this history actually begins with the Aadhi Hindu Mahasabha, a Dalit political organization that was led by basically poet activists. The most famous you may have heard of is Swami Anand, who was based in Delhi and in Kanpur, and another poet or Kavi, Jagat Ram Chatia, who was based in Delhi, and a dozen other Dalit poet activists who actually created an extensive discussion on the subject of Santmat religion in the early 20th century. Although Aadhi Hindu Mahasabha was launched in 1923, and its leaders were active in the 1916 onwards, and Aadhi Hindu Mahasabha continued to be active until the 1940. And so the book that Scott mentioned, The Language of Liberalism, actually draws from this material. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to highlight what I believe are some of the principles of Santmat religion that were raised by Dalit poet activists in their writings. And this is a large corpus of at least 40 books that were published between 1916 and 1940. And they cover a range of themes. There are speeches, song book collections, there are dramas, plays. So kind of culling from this material, what I found is that these five principles that actually occupy a dominant, prominent place in this literature, the idea of Satguru or Satnam. And these are the categories that are used in this literature. So that I'm drawing from the terms that are used in this literature. And so Satguru or Satnam, the idea of Santmat, the concept, I can talk about that also later in the question and answer session. The notion of Atam, Anubhav, Gyan, and the genealogy of the poet saints, especially around Raidas and Kabir. I mean, so they actually began to talk about and write about the genealogies of these two poet saints, as they were called. So what I'm going to do in the remaining part of the presentation is talk about the notion of Atam, Anubhav, Gyan. The way I translate it is the knowledge acquired through personal experience. The notion of Atma Anubhav Gyan actually emerged systematically after the formation of Aadhi Hindu Mahasabha and its publications. The Aadhi Hindu Mahasabha Press began to publish a lot on Sant Mat and Atma Anubhav Gyan. And one of the first examples I found of Sant Mat was in this speech given by Swami Achyutanand in 1926, where he addresses 3,000 Dalit audience in Mainpuri town, where he argued that the philosophy of Adi Hindus is a distinct ancient theory, and the ancient theory code is actually in the speech. And he argues that this is based on the notion of Atam Gyan or Anubhav, the knowledge attained by a person through self-realization that had always informed the praxis of Sant Mat. So what he says, and I'm going to say this in Hindi, पर वह आत्म ज्ञान अनुभव विकास वेद से परे की बात है जो सदा संत मत रूप में प्रचलित रहा है और है. This is actually a quote from the speech about Achyutanand used the principles of Atam, Anubhav, Gyan, and Anubhav to highlight agency of the learner in creating new knowledge by investigating the social, which is at the heart of Santmat philosophy, and to distinguish it from the Vedic literature and the Brahman Sanskrit knowledge that Orthodox Hindu consider as the final word on accumulated knowledge. So I believe he offered an original proposition about the history and role of Santmat religion that emphasized a knowledge acquired through personal experience. A few years later, on January 13, 1929, this is another speech. Not this one. This is another speech that he gives in 1930, where he further developed this idea that Santmat is the religion of Adi Hindus because the teachings of poet saints rely on the notion of Atam Anubhav Gyan. And therefore, both are vital to present politics and ethics of Dalits. Now, one of the most systematic discussion of Atam Gyan actually takes place in this Vigyan Bhajan Mala that was published in 1926. And as you say in the middle part, it says Sant Mat Sar. It's a brief, brief survey of the Sant Mat religion. So the Vigyan Bhajan Mala, published in February 1926, one of the first devotional tract published by the Mahasabha Press, offered a systematic treatment of Atam Anubhav Gyan. Writing on the last page of Vigyan Bhajan Mala, D.R. Jatia, who's the managing editor of Adi Hindu Mahasabha Press, stated the objective of publishing the tract was to rescue and promote Atam Anubhav Gyan as the philosophy of Adi Hindus' Sant Mat religion. It occupied an important place in the 16-page tract, appearing in 16 out of 24 verses in the tract. So it appears, the discussion of Sant Mat appears in 16 songs out of the 24 songs in this pamphlet. And for example, in a song titled Prarthana Theatre, Prarthana Theatre Dhvani. In this song, it argues that the awareness of the notion of Atam Anubhav is associated with the discovery and recognition by a person of the divinity of Sadguru, the Supreme Lord. So, so let me kind of flag this constant evocation of, knowledge acquired through personal experience was being offered as a kind of a core philosophical principle around which the idea of Sant Mat was erected by these poet activists. And the argument they will make in other writings is that this was something emphasized by Kabir and Rai Das, and they were able to challenge hierarchy and caste because of this capacity that they utilize this notion of Atma Anubhav Gyan to challenge caste and hierarchy, and promote the idea of Satnam, of Satguru. And this Atma Anubhav Gyan, I would argue, is actually quite central in contemporary Dalit politics and in contemporary Dalit Hindi writing. So if you look at the writings of contemporary Dalit Hindi writers, Dr. Tej Singh, Dr. Kamal Bharti, Dr. Shirali Singh Bechan, they've all addressed the question of Atma Anubhav Gyan. And each of them have argued that Kabir and Raidas composed their songs, their teachings from the wisdom, mat, gained from their experience and understanding. I think, I believe it is Dr. Tej Singh, these three people, Dr. Tej Singh and especially Dr. Tej Singh and Dr. Shiraj Singh were professors at University of Delhi of Hindi literature in Hindi department in Delhi University. And I want to emphasize Dr. Tej Singh's essay that was published in 2003. It was called Dalit Renaissance and Raidas. And it was published in a Hindi patrika called Apeksha, or Expectation, it was a quarterly magazine that he edited for almost 15 years. And this was a special issue in Raidas. And in this issue, argued that Raidas and Dalit Renaissance was shaped by this notion of Atma Anubhav Gyan. And he argued that it was the Atma Anubhav Gyan that enabled Dalit poet saints to articulate a distinctive position. And he argued in that essay that it is this perspective, this notion, that also inspires and motivates Dalit Hindi writing to distinguish themselves from the mainstream caste Hindu writers of Hindi literature. And I think one of the things he makes very clear in this essay, he argued that Atma Anubhav is different from Atma that is used in Vaishnava literature. The Atma and Atma is different, to the emphasis on self. And that he argued that is central in this, that he emphasizes a lot in his essay. So let me kind of briefly sum up, as this example of Dr. Tej Singh's essay, suggests that Atma Anubhav Gyan is critical to understanding the agency of Dalit poet saints of Sant Mat, whether it is Kabir and Raidas, that it informed their ability to critique caste and hierarchy. It was this argument for Atma Anubhav Gyan was actually first made by Swami Achyutanand and Dalit poet activists of 1910s and 20s in their writings and collections. And what I've tried to suggest here is that there's this longevity of this idea that I've not encountered in any Hindi literary studies or religious studies, the idea of Atma Anubhav Gyan. Or maybe I've missed it, but it's something that is fundamental to Dalit writing on religion and also in literature. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Rawat, and thank you for keeping to the time all by yourself.
Thank you.
Wonderful self-discipline and a great example for all of us. That was a really stimulating paper presentation, and we will come back with questions at the end for you. The next speaker, I'm happy to introduce Deepa Sundaram. She's a scholar of performance, ritual, and digital culture, whose research examines the formation of Hindu virtual religious publics. Her current monograph project is titled Globalizing Dharma, the Making of a Global Hindu Brand. And it examines how commercial ritual websites fashion a new digital repository for the majoritarian Hindu religious praxis through a systematic Vedicizing of virtual spaces. So this speaks to some of the questions that came up in the last panel about the use of digital technology to transmit religious teachings, religious belonging, and maybe even initiation. So thank you, Deepa.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to share my screen, and given the time constraint, I think I'm just going to focus on my examples and talk a little bit about how they work. So let me do this first. Okay. So I titled this paper, The Rashtra is Online, in homage to Rohit Chopra's book, in part because it was so important for how I think about Hindu majoritarianism in digital spaces. And I'm going to sort of put this up here first, and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by devotional publics. I think it's important to start with the fact that the price of mobile internet worldwide is a really important aspect of how these publics work. If you'll notice, in most of India, right, this is from 2019, the average price of a gigabyte is actually less than $1. And this is partly what makes it so effective to organize on digital spaces, particularly through social media platforms and messaging platforms, which is going to be the focus of my talk today. And so I want to sort of talk about two different, one moment here. I want to talk about sort of two different types of devotional publics today, and they're very different. And I'm going to start out by saying a little bit about, how devotional publics work, which in part is that they are forged networks of like-minded individuals that find community in these spaces. And when I say these spaces, we're talking about a variety of different digital spaces and platforms. These could be apps, these could be websites. One of the areas of research that I focus on are Facebook groups, which are really interesting because they're both networked and sort of closed off. And so they can really form both echo chambers that operate on a network. But not all devotional publics are necessarily, sort of geared towards extremism per se. And so we've seen several different kinds of, we can call them transnational gurus, people like Jagi Sadhguru, Baba Ramdev, and of course, Amma, the hugging guru, who have capitalized on the ways in which social media networks are about maximizing business and marketing relationships, not really about maximizing human relationships. Likes and shares should be understood as capital, not as sort of connection in the same way that we or in the way that we might think of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Amma's platform and sort of why I think it's really important. And what I'm really looking at in my paper is this idea of how digital devotional publics that are produced in digital spaces have material consequences. And they, even when they are not sort of what we would call blatantly violent or extremist, still contribute to Hindu majoritarianism and all of the accoutrements that go along with that, including what Dr. Rawat talked about in terms of the kinds of alternative devotional publics we see that are really about resisting some of this Hindu majoritarianism, particularly from Dalit and tribal communities like Adivasi communities. So I want to start with Amma, and Amma is really an interesting figure. She has really come to the fore, and this is a picture from her 2018 tour. She's come to the fore as a figure who has really focused on creating this amorphous spiritual network that is predicated on shared sort of vague values like love and God. They're not necessarily exclusively or even explicitly Hindu, but what they do is bring together folks that what I would call like people who identify as Hindu, maybe in some cases, and of course it also includes other people, but also people who are sort of identify as part of a liberal spirituality space. And that space has a number of values that are associated with it. This idea that why can't we all live together? Why can't we all focus on love? Why can't we, treat our fellow man better? And on its face, these values are good. They are not bad. But what she's done is really market them and use these networks, especially the online social media networks, to sort of market them, these values, as a way to sort of increase her own brand, to sort of promote her own brand. And so what I've shown here are these different parts of her own website. So she has these different programs. You can donate to global charities. You can also join them in various retreats. But what's particularly interesting about, and I'm actually going to skip this slide, but what's particularly interesting about Amma is that she's very enterprising in a variety of different media spaces. So everything from, she has her own TV channel to having a number of different apps. And unlike someone like Baba Ramdev, she is marketing herself as something that can lead one to spiritual unity. Ramdev and people like him are more interested in sort of using their persona to market their products. So he puts himself out there because he wants to sort of draw attention to his website, Patanjali Ayurveda, and sort of market a number of different products that have nothing to do with spirituality, like shampoo, soap, and things like that. But Amma is really interested in using these mobile spaces as a way to think about her own sort of brand. What does it look like? And so here's her mobile app. And I wanted to briefly say about her mobile app before I continue on. I downloaded her mobile app when I was doing research on Amma a couple of years ago, and it defaults to showing her face on your screen some 23 times a day, and you can't remove it. It's on there for a full 3 seconds. And it looks at you and says, don't forget to perform seva. And she's looking right at you. And it's this really, it started to actually, I started to see her face at night. It was actually very jarring, I say powerful because I couldn't stop seeing it. In fact, I had to get rid of the app because I couldn't reduce it to anything less than 4 times a day. But I find it really interesting. So it's not just a branding process for Amma, but it's also this process of constantly bombarding her devotees in her digital sphere with her image as the source of this love, as the source of this hugging. So to conclude my section on Amma, what she's really trying to do is build a network of adherents that sort of believe in these vague spiritual values to which she markets a particular set of products that are geared towards building this community. And she uses her face and her image to do it. And this is something that in a lot of ways is not necessarily, and I would never call this necessarily Hindu nationalist, but what it does do is it allows her to sort of efface some of the more problematic aspects of certain parts of seva, certain parts of ritual, to sort of, make them, to divorce them, let me say, from their histories and from their religious context, to sort of promote them as something that is accessible as an everyman spirituality. So I'm going to switch gears to somebody who's very different, who I'm sure many of us are familiar with, the Swami Narasinga Anand Saraswati. What's interesting, of course, is that Narasinga Anand has been in the news a lot from, more recently. However, he has been engaging in a type of hate community building for a very long time. Going back to 2015, and I don't have time to show this video today, but I do encourage all of you to watch it. Going back to 2015, the Quint did a story on him showing how he was building an army, what he called a Dharma Sena, of 15,000 Hindus to fight ISIS. And the way he builds community is very different as a religious figure. And he, again, is using online platforms to sort of have a material result. So as you can see here, he talks about having to launch a revolution on the land of Gurgaon. And more recently, he and some groups that he affiliates with were associated with organizing havans to block public namaz prayer. And I realized that I'm sort of running out of time, so I want to actually skip ahead a little bit. This woman is named Chetna Sharma, and she's part of something called the Akhanda Hindustan Morcha. And she's sort of a right-hand woman for Narasinga Anand. She's incredibly popular on social media, and she has the distinction of saying, and I'll actually, oops, sorry. I'm not going to show this video. She has the distinction of being a part of these Hindu Swabiman training camps. This is the first organization that Narasinga Anand started. And these training camps have the motto of Gita in one hand, gun in the other. And so if you listen to the video, you'll see that they are learning to chant the Gita while also learning to shoot weapons. And most of the children that come to these camps are between the ages of 8 and 13. And they do have some older ones that come along and help run the training. And so here are some figures that Saraswati associates with, and these are the sort of ways that they build community. It's a very different kind of community. It's really built through a kind of fear politics and a fear of a Hindu genocide. And I want to draw attention to one thing, because I know I'm about out of time. Notice Chetna Sharma's comment. We broadcast one WhatsApp message to 2.5 lakh people. She actually goes on to say that she doesn't have a website. They don't have a website. They only use WhatsApp groups and Facebook messaging. And the reason for that is partly because of security, but also because they don't want to be tracked by anyone. And this is a really different way of building community than we see with someone like Amma. But both of them, both these groups, and I'll leave up this last slide here. This is a picture of a havan that was actually organized on WhatsApp groups and used to block namaz prayer for about 3 months, and essentially leading to places being closed down. But both of these groups both of these gurus are using online platforms to create devotional publics, but these publics are predicated on very different principles, right? One on this idea of an amorphous idea of love and spirituality, and the other on hate. And what they both have in common is a kind of allegiance to a Hindu majoritarianism, a kind of Hindu supremacy. One is doing it much more covertly, and that's Amma, right? And then we see with Narasinga Anand, the shift towards sort of more overt calls to this. And they're of course doing it with very different kinds of end goals. One is more militant, and one is more about sort of creating adherence to a certain set of values. And maybe that's a place where they actually share some overlap as well. And I'm going to stop there. I have lots more to say, but I can happily expand on this in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepa. Yeah, very rich presentation, and we can imagine that there is so much more to talk about. We'll get to it in the questions and answers at the end. Next, I'd like to introduce Anna Bigelow. She is an associate professor of Islamic studies in the Department of Religious Studies, at Stanford. And her work explores how everyday devotional life in shared sacred spaces illuminates the shifting terrain of ambivalently secular states. She's recently published a book called an edited volume, Islam Through Objects, on material culture and Islam in religious studies. And she's working on a long-term project which tips its hat to William James, entitled The Varieties of Secular Experience, rather than the varieties of religious experience. Anna?
Thank you, Scott. And also you should tip your own hat that you are a contributor to the Islam Through Objects volume. And I'm very grateful for that. I'm also grateful for Rohit and the organization that you've been able to accomplish here. It's really remarkable to bring so many of us together in this way. So thank you for that. Okay, hopefully that is visible now to everybody. Yes, thank you. Great. So I'd like to just begin, of course, with the land acknowledgement that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people, and consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. I'd also just like to acknowledge that this is a challenging time for many, particularly those in Ukraine, but also our fellow humans in Yemen, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere around the world. And I'm very mindful of that. So this opportunity has brought me back to the place and that I did my first book project on. And it has been a really interesting journey to circle back in the present political and cultural environment in South Asia to a place where, for decades, the Muslim majority town of Malerkotla in Punjab has been emblematic of communal harmony, the place where everyone gets along, where peace reigns supreme. As I've argued previously, the substantive realities that this reputation reflects is the result of hard work and constant vigilance to realize on the ground, even imperfectly. It also persists despite enormous and obviously increasing pressure. The last decade since I wrote Sharing the Sacred on the town's history and culture of communal harmony has proven challenging for Malerkotla's citizens, but their labors continue. From the anti-CAA protests centered in Shaheen Bagh to the farmers' protests at the Delhi borders, to election-driven concerns, Malerkotla's citizens continue to strive for belonging in an India where divisive nationalisms are ascendant. These efforts reveal the past and present of citizen strategies to build intersectional solidarities, to affirm and reaffirm a long-standing collective identity built on communal harmony, and to imagine a future India that is diverse, inclusive, and just. A former princely state, Malerkotla is now the only Muslim majority municipality in Indian Punjab, a state with a Muslim population just under 2% according to 2011 census data. It's also a place where the Punjabi Muslim population mostly remained in India in 1947 and where no one died during the violence that accompanied partition, or that essentially was partition. This singular status has long meant that all eyes are on Malerkotla during any period of communal strife affecting Punjab. From the widespread unrest after the destruction of the Babri Masjid in 1992, to the Kargil War with Pakistan in 1999, to the unrest after the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas and the US-led campaign in Afghanistan in 2001, the Godhra pogroms of 2002, the Mumbai Taj Hotel attacks of 2008, and all sorts of other flashpoints, Malerkotla coincidentally appears in the regional and sometimes national news. Additionally, we hear about the town on Muslim holy days and days significant to the history of Malerkotla, such as the January 17th anniversary of the 1872 British execution of the Namthari Sikhs, or, of course, the commemoration of the martyrdom of Guru Gobind Singh's two younger sons that was memorably protested by the Nawab of Malerkotla in 1705, an act known as the Ha Danara, or Cry for Justice. Even minor political incidents and issues of economic or educational development are often conveyed through the filter of religion in media coverage of the town. But by far, the overwhelming narrative is one of communal harmony. As The Wire recently, As The Wire recently headlined a story by political scientist Meera Chandoke, in Malerkotla, one can find the vestiges of India's forgotten history of tolerance. In her essay, as in so many others, we find a heady mix of nostalgia and utopia, a combination that seeks to mobilize the unquestionably powerful symbol of a town of peaceful, patriotic Muslims as emblematic of a more universal past and a model for a less conflicted future. This is a significant amount of pressure on a town of under 150,000 people, and there are real questions to ask about the impact of this pressure on Malerkotla and its citizens. In her 2014 book, Citizen, An American Lyric, Claudia Rankine speaks in poetic prose about the effects on Black Americans of being a model minority. Quote, "They achieve themselves to death, trying to dodge the buildup of erasure," end quote. India today is witnessing a buildup of erasure of Muslim histories and Muslim futures. Textbooks alter or eliminate any contributions or achievements of Indian Muslims in the past. Assaults and lynchings of Muslims in the name of cow protection or love jihad go uninvestigated and unpunished. Calls for genocidal campaigns against Muslims in the model of that perpetrated against the Rohingya in Myanmar are met largely with silence from the government. And as these events unfold, and especially in Punjab, all eyes are always on Malerkotla. On May 13th, 2021, Malerkotla became the 23rd electoral district of Punjab. The declaration by the then Chief Minister Amarinder Singh was made on Eid al-Fitr as a gesture acknowledging the unique status of this Muslim majority region in Indian Punjab. Seen by supporters as a positive move to ally his political party, which was then the Indian National Congress, and he has since started his own Punjab Lok Congress, but it was seen to ally his party with the region's reputation for communal harmony. However, it was unsurprisingly critiqued by political rivals as pandering at best or divisive appeasement at worst. Indeed, this relatively insignificant act was taken up by elected officials several states away, as, for example, UP Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath of the BJP weighed in to describe the making of the Punjabi district as typical of the, quote, divisive politics of the Congress, end quote. No stranger to communal division himself, Adityanath's comments seek to frame policies that offer a perceived benefit to a minority community as engendering division and resentment through preferential treatment that unfairly penalizes those who have benefited from the status quo. In a similar vein, the BJP's national spokesperson, Shazia Ilmi, accused a Malerkotla-based aide of Chief Minister Charanjit Singh Channi of the Congress Party of trying to, quote, disturb communal harmony, end quote. The incident in question there involved some remarks that an aide, Muhammad Mustafa, made that were insulting to the local Marasi community. Marasis in Malerkotla are a hereditary group of Muslim singers and performers and stigmatized as low-caste entertainers. While Mustafa's comments may reveal cultural and social prejudice towards this historically marginalized community, the BJP reaction is also evidence of political opportunism that seeks to drive wedges between minority groups. Electoral strategy aside, such BJP efforts to represent other political parties and policies as divisive and communal while engaging in divisive and communal pursuits of their own is not just hypocrisy. It is also a strategic probing for weaknesses at the outer defenses of a town that has built its identity on being the place where everyone gets along. The narrative in praise of Malerkotla's atmosphere of brotherhood runs directly counter to assertions that Hindus and Muslims have decisively different cultures and cannot coexist. And so Malerkotla's Muslims and many non-Muslim residents labor to resist erasure through a steady parade of patriotic performances and acts of solidarity with other religious communities. During the protests against the Citizens Amendment Act and National Registry of Citizens, thousands of people, mostly women, gathered at Shaheen Bagh in Delhi from December 15th, 2019 until the pandemic lockdown that began in March 2020. While this was the epicenter of much mobilization, demonstrations, of course, occurred throughout the country, including in Malerkotla. Several student leaders and poets who had galvanized the Shaheen Bagh community came to Malerkotla on February 9th, in 2020, organized by a group calling themselves the Had Nara Sangharsh Morcha. Among the poets was Nabia Khan, who recited her well-known poem now, Aayega Inqilab, The Revolution Will Come, that has the refrain, Aayega Inqilab, Penke Bindi, Churiyan Burqa Hijab. The revolution will come, dressed in bindi, bangles, burqa, hijab. The sentiment as a rallying cry is well suited to the women-led demonstrations and to the multi-religious culture of Malerkotla. After the sudden shutdown for the pandemic on March 24th, 2020, thousands of workers were stranded at jobs that no longer existed, and many had to walk home without other resources. In Punjab, people without food or work could reliably find food at the langar at many Sikh gurdwaras. From Malerkotla, loads of grain were sent to the center of the Sikh community, the Golden Temple in Amritsar. While making their deliveries there, the Muslims who had brought the grain prayed namaz at the plaza outside the complex, images of which went viral on social media. In the fall of 2020, the farmers' protests geared up in opposition to a set of agricultural bills that many farmers, especially from Punjab, objected to on numerous grounds, including the absence of government-secured prices that would promote a living wage for farmers. As Malerkotla is a primarily agricultural district with farmers of all religious commitments, it was not surprising to see langar tents staffed by Muslim delegations from the town. Local solidarity demonstrations were also held, including some that were primarily mobilizing women. Importantly, it's not only Malerkotla's Muslim population that engages in these repeated performances of belonging. Gestures of respect, friendship, and resistance to forces of division are also frequent local and regional news items. For example, in June 2021, it was reported nationally when Sikh farmer Jagmeil Singh donated land for a mosque in Malerkotla district. Or in May 2021, Bahad Nagar Gurdwara in Malerkotla hosted a group of Muslims for namaz while also providing langar to Muslim youth at a local madrasa who were more or less isolated during lockdown. So these few examples begin to illustrate the amount of vigilance and constant effort required to remain visible and resist erasure. That such stories are seen as newsworthy, that they garner this attention beyond state or local media, suggests that there's a wider public that longs for such narratives to help bolster the struggle for multi-religious belonging in contemporary India. It also indicates that efforts to divide the community and undermine the hard-won comedy are underway. Raising the profile of the town in such outlets may produce a double effect, both reinforcing the collective ethos of harmony in Malerkotla and making it more appealing than ever to undermine it. A somewhat dangerous romanticization of the atmosphere of brotherhood is also a danger, as it obscures the work involved in asserting and maintaining the intergroup trust and promoting political and social solidarity as a collective good. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you.
Others.
Thank you so much, Anna. And again, everyone's being so wonderfully cooperative to be aware of their own time and to give respect and space to the folks coming next. I totally appreciate how well you're doing. And our next speaker I welcome to the virtual podium here is Shirali Tarin. Shirali is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College. He received his PhD in Religious Studies from Duke University, but we like him anyway. His research focuses on Muslim intellectual traditions and debates in early Muslim and modern South Asia. His first book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, which came out in 2020, received a number of commendations and awards. It received the American Institute of Pakistan Studies Book Prize and was selected as a finalist for the American Academy of Religion Book Award in 2021. It's a really monumental book. A great deal of effort went into it, and there are many, many insights packed in there. So Shirali, thank you for that. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Scott. And thank you so much, Rohit, for organizing this conference and for including me in it. Although it's still only February, but you already have the Best Conference Organizer of the Year award. Thank you so much. I've prepared some comments to stay within my 12 minutes. And this presentation comes from a brief extract of one chapter of my current book project, which looks at intra-Muslim scholarly debates and discourses on the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim friendship from the mid-18th to the mid-20th century. On the early morning of March 17th, 1876, Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi died 1877, one of the founders of the prestigious South Asian Islamic Seminary, the Deoband Madrasa, established in 1866, boarded a train from his native village of Nanota in Uttar Pradesh, northern India. Traveling via Delhi for a journey of roughly 400 miles, his eventual destination was the small village of Chandapur in the northern Indian district of Shahjahanpur. The objective of Nanotwi's visit to Chandapur was to participate in an interreligious polemical festival known as the Festival of Deciding the True God, Mela-e-Khuda Shinasi. Accompanied by a retinue of around 20 disciples and associates, some professional debaters and others driven by the anticipation of entertainment, Nanotwi had been invited to this festival by the local Muslims of Shahjahanpur, who had desired a prominent Muslim scholar to defend Islam at the event. This festival was held for 2 consecutive years in 1875 and 1876 in the same location. In my 12 minutes, by describing certain key fragments of the Shahjahanpur polemic, as narrated from the perspective of Deobandi historiography, I wish to highlight some of the novel conceptions of religion, history, and the public that it brought into view. More specifically, I'm interested in the question of how, following the loss of Muslim political sovereignty in South Asia, distinct visions of sovereign power are attached to the body and figure of Prophet Muhammad. especially in such moments of interreligious contest and encounter. The polemical festival of Shahjahanpur brought together leading Christian missionaries and Hindu and Muslim scholars in India, charged with the task of debating and defending the authenticity of their respective religions. Qasim Nanotwi, who led the contingent of Muslim scholars at this event, is a towering figure in the intellectual history of Islam in South Asia. Though he died at a relatively young age of 44, he wrote prolifically on a broad range of subjects, including law, theology, philosophy, and Sufism, and was one of the founders of arguably the most influential Muslim reform movement and seminary in modern South Asia, the Deoband Madrasa. Apart from Qasim Nanotwi, the most prominent religious figure who attended this festival was the arch polemicist and founder of the Hindu reformist group, the Arya Samaj, the Ananda Saraswati, died 1883. Saraswati had very recently, only a year ago, published his scandalous polemic against different religious traditions, Satyat Prakash, the Light of Truth. In a chapter devoted exclusively to Islam, the Ananda had scathingly mocked the Quran and Prophet Muhammad, causing the fury among Muslim scholars. The leading protagonist representing Christianity at this event was someone called Father Knowles, a British missionary in Shahjahanpur from the Methodist Episcopal Mission, who had served as the headmaster of a local missionary school for 4 years. He had rapidly grown in prominence thanks to his remarkably effective proselytizing campaigns in the region. A charismatic and aggressive debater, Knowles had participated in a series of such polemics, though none of this scale. The polemic of Shahjahanpur was organized through the patronage of the British magistrate of the district, Robert George Gray. In addition to Gray, the primary sponsor of the event, who also handled all the logistical arrangements, was a certain Munshi Pyare Lal, a wealthy Hindu landowner of Shahjahanpur. It was Pyare Lal who had originally devised the idea of a public showdown between religious communities and scholars from competing traditions, and then supervised its execution. Thus, one can think of the Shahjahanpur polemic as a shared venture between the machineries of the colonial state and the indigenous landed elite. Now, why would the colonial state be interested in patronizing such spectacles of interreligious encounter? While the question of motives is never conclusively apparent, what is clearly at work here is the expression of a modern colonial logic of secularism, whereby the domain of religious passions and contest is protected and even celebrated, and yet also quarantined from the spheres of politics and governance. The physical and discursive site of the Shahjahanpur polemic reinforced the dual colonial promise of advancing the mission of civilizing the native through missionary activity and separating the field of indigenous religious quarrels and debate from that of politics and state governance. Preparations for this event had been underway for many months in advance. It was heavily advertised in local newspapers and in other public venues, such as local schools, shops, and through the distribution of pamphlets. In addition to the polemic participants, hundreds of people from neighboring towns and villages, especially Deoband, Meerut, Delhi, Moradabad, Rampur, Sambhal, and Bareilly, attended the event and served as spectators to this mega polemical showdown. The actual event was held under large tents that had been put up on a tract of barren land in Chandapur. Each contingent representing Islam, Christianity, and Hinduism were camped in their own respective tents, retiring to their lodges after each day's proceedings. The British Magistrate's Office provided more than 200 chairs, food, and other necessary items for the event. They also arranged for the local police to monitor the venue and to prevent the eruption of communal violence. The festival lasted 4 days each year. As one might expect, the historiography of each group claims its own victory. The polemic itself focused on a range of theological and philosophical problems, including monotheism, divine will, human agency, the problem of evil, rebirth and transmigration, miracles, the authenticity of scriptures, and so on, as each side strived to establish the exclusive authenticity of its doctrinal system. For the remainder of my time, I turn my focus to a specific discursive moment that was among the most heated and illuminating moments of disagreement during this polemical festival: the question of prophetic miracles, or the question of whose miracles are most miraculous. In Satyat Prakash, the Ananda Saraswati, while impugning Prophet Muhammad and trying to frame him as an impostor, had especially attacked the credibility of miracles attached to Muhammad and of miracles found in the Quran more broadly. In responding to Saraswati's provocations, Qasim Nanotwi did two things. One, he tried to establish the superiority and incredibility of Prophet Muhammad's miracles over those of pre-Islamic prophets who figure prominently in Judaism and Christianity. The most famous of Muhammad's miracles in this regard was, of course, the incident of the splitting of the moon in half, through which the Prophet answered and silenced the recalcitrant unbelievers of Mecca who had demanded a miracle from him. By splitting the moon in half, Muhammad had transformed and uncoupled the original form of the moon. Thus, for Nanotwi, this was a miracle much more incredible and scientifically improbable than, and hence superior to, other prophetic miracles dealing with natural phenomena, such as, say, Prophet Joshua's famous miracle of having made the sun stay stationary for a long time. According to Nanotwi, there was nothing particularly incredible about that, since every journey or movement eventually culminates in rest. Therefore, by keeping the sun stationary for a long time, Joshua had simply confirmed the natural laws of movement, as opposed to Prophet Muhammad's miracle of splitting the moon in half that had dramatically interrupted rather than reinforced the laws of nature. Now, having established the superiority of Muhammad's miracles over the miracles of Jewish and Christian prophets, the rather fascinating details of which are in the longer written version of this chapter, Nanotwi offered a curious explanation for why he had omitted any mention of Hindu miracles in his discussion. The logic of his explanation is of considerable interest to me because it is quite revealing of the way he imagined the interaction of history, sovereignty, and religious authenticity. According to Nanotwi, the main reason for the omission of Hindu miracles from his exposition was the poor standards of historical writing that marked the Hindu tradition. As he put it, no historian would consider histories of the Hindus as reliable, end of quote. For instance, Nanotwi explained, the splitting of the moon was also mentioned in the Mahabharata as an event that took place during the reign of the celebrated Hindu sage Vishwamitra. However, Nanotwi bemoaned, one finds no reliable chain of transmission, sanad, connecting the author of the Mahabharata with the narrator from the era of Vishwamitra. He proceeded to speculate that, in all probability, the Hindus have stolen the moon-splitting incident from Muslim historiography. According to Nanotwi, this kind of historical ineptitude stood in stark contrast with the Muslim tradition that was universally recognized for its historicist prowess. As Nanotwi triumphantly put it, and I quote him here, no religion can rival Islam in the department of establishing the soundness of religious discourses and oral traditions. Especially the narrative of the Prophet's splitting of the moon is beyond any doubt. This event was documented in prophetic reports that were massively transmitted with uninterrupted chains of transmission. Now, but if the Muslim standards of historical empiricism were indeed so unrivaled, then why was this event, the Prophet's splitting of the moon, not recorded in world histories? This was precisely a question that Dayananda Saraswati had raised in his attempt to undermine the authenticity of this story. Saraswati had argued that the absence of the splitting of the moon narrative in world histories clearly showed that Muslims had fabricated the story and attached it to Prophet Muhammad. But Nanotwi was not to be so easily outshone in the department of empiricist chauvinism. Nanotwi responded to Dayananda's charge of fabrication by first reminding his arch-rival that even Hindu miracles were not found in any histories of the world. As he sarcastically asked, in which history of the world was the Mahabharata's narrative of the splitting of the moon in Vishwamitra's reign recorded? Nanotwi proceeded by explaining the absence of the moon-splitting incident in world histories through arguments that combined desire for scientific certitude with purposeful penchant for theatrical apologetics. He said, at that time, meaning the time when the moon split in half, it must have been approaching midnight in India, and dawn had not struck yet in Western countries. Add to this the fact that it was the middle of the winter. People in India were buried under their blankets. They were intoxicated in their dreams, unaware of even their own existence. In this condition, it was impossible for them to take notice of an event like the splitting of the moon that took place for only a few fleeting seconds. And even if someone were awake at that time, why on earth would he be staring at the sky in anticipation of the moon to split? Moreover, the pollution and the dust in the air must have also made it very difficult to see the sky clearly. Now, coming to my conclusion. Notice the intimacy of historicism and religious authenticity in Nanotwi's thought. History and inclusion in a domain of knowledge called world histories represented the discursive battleground on which the authenticity of a religious tradition was to be contested and determined. The authenticity of a religion depended on its capacity to be empirically historicized. Hinduism thus was not even part of history proper. At the same time, in memory of the Prophet nestled in the sovereign fortress of historicist vigor, compensated for the sovereign lack of a moment marked by the absence of Muslim political sovereignty. The main point on which I want to end is this. Certainly, at the polemic of Shahjahanpur, Nanotwi was participating in a long-running tradition of interreligious polemical contestation in Islam known as the Munazara tradition, predating the colonial period by many centuries. However, the conceptual and institutional terrain in which he was obliged to operate during the Shahjahanpur polemic was resoundingly new, defined by the emergence of a new public sphere in which the state at once managed and patronized religious debates, the spectatorship of a public readily available to be reformed, preached, and doctrinally persuaded, The availability of a new conceptual object called religion that was known through its propositional doctrines and evaluated through its historicist rigor, and the emergence of a new kind of subject in public whose job it was to decide on the truth and untruth of competing religious claims. Thus, at the festival of deciding the true God, even as Nanotwi served as a defender of tradition, he was also what the anthropologist David Scott so memorably called a conscript of modernity. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Shirali. Our next and last speaker before we turn to questions is Stephen Vos from Colorado College. He's a visiting assistant professor there in the Department of Religion. He's a historian of the Jain traditions, especially of Gujarat and Rajasthan. He holds a PhD in South Asian Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. And his first book, Reimagining Jainism in Islamic India, Jain Intellectual Culture in the Delhi Sultanate, is forthcoming from Routledge. And it won a lovely prize, the Edward C. Dimmock Jr. Book Prize in Indian Humanities from AIIS, American Institute of Indian Studies. That is something to be proud of and to build on. And Professor Vos, I pass the podium on to you, please.
Thank you very much, Scott, for that. And yeah, after confessing my pedigree as a historian, I'm now going to be talking about things that happened last week. Yeah, so as a scholar of Jains, I'm really interested in the formation of Jain communities. And the first book project was really looking at how this new historical moment of the Delhi Sultanate led Jains to re-articulate who they are as a community. And that's a process that I see continuing to happen into the present day. And so this current book project is in some ways getting me back to my more anthropological roots, but also kind of stretching out into kind of new media theory and things like that. So what I'll present today is a little snippet of what I'm seeing going on with one particular Jain movement, let's say. And I'm really interested in your feedback about how I'm going about theorizing this. So with that, I'll share my screen. Pretty sure this is the one I want. Yes. Okay, so the organization that I'll be talking about today is called the Srimad Raj Chandra Mission of Dharampur, Gujarat. And they are creating what I am calling a global Jain public, and they're largely doing it through their social media strategy. So this is the splash page of their website. It's a few years old now, but the Srimad Raj Chandra Mission of Dharampur, or the SRMD, as you'll frequently hear me call it, is ostensibly an organization devoted to this figure, Srimad Raj Chandra, who was a 19th century Jain layman and a friend of a young Mohandas Gandhi, if anyone's known about him. And who is generally considered within the Jain tradition a kind of mystic and a kind of quasi-reformer in a way. He wrote a number of tracts early on in his life that were about sort of very critical of the mendicant hierarchies or the mendicant gachas within the Shwetambar Jain tradition of Western India. And he was very skeptical of image worship and sort of the devotional life that kind of wedded Jain society together. Jain society is sort of traditionally or tropically structured around what's called the fourfold Sangha, which are monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen. And that there's very much a sensibility that this is sort of what keeps the Jain Tirtha together. And so Srimad Rajchandra's criticism is in large part a kind of a modern rereading of Jain religious life that was an attempt to sort of look deeper into kind of individualized spirituality and was somewhat skeptical of the kind of caste-based formation of the Jain Sangha. And this organization, the SRMD, was started in 2001 by this figure here. His name is Rakesh Bhai Javeri, or as he's now going, Rakesh G. Javeri. Who is the son of a very wealthy family from Mumbai and actually wrote his PhD dissertation from the University of Bombay on Srimad Rajchandra. So very briefly, if you were to go to a typical Jain temple in India, you would get a kind of sensibility of who the religious authority figures are just by walking in. So, of course, the main figures at any Jain temple are the Jinnah images here that are in the lower left. But if you look around, you'll also see other kinds of figures here, particularly goddesses. And this is the goddess Padmavati, who's shown here. And you'll often frequently find memorial statues to the monks, who are sort of the major historical figures and leaders of the community for a particular mendicant lineage, or gacha, as I mentioned. And you'll often find memorial statues to laymen as well, figures who built temples, supported the communities, served as ministers to kings, and so forth. And it is the linkage of sort of the goddess's protection over the Jain community and the support of especially monks and laymen for the kind of structure of the society that kind of holds together any particular Jain community around a notion of caste. So we have Shrimal Jains, Oswal Jains, Agarwals, Khandelwals, all sort of form different Jain castes. And it's really only in the modern period that these caste groupings really started to articulate a kind of supra-caste identity around religion as being sort of in common Jains. And so this is a photograph of the figure of Raja Chandra here. And as I mentioned, right, Raja Chandra was sort of very much into kind of personal practice, meditation, and was really reluctant to join any monastic order and kind of posited a very independent path to spirituality. Interestingly, Emma Salter, a scholar in the UK, as recently as 2006, posited that the worldwide kind of Jain interest in Srimad Rajchandra and his writings probably amounted to about 20,000 Jains worldwide who regularly engaged with his works, met in reading groups, things like that. By about 2013, when the SRMD's kind of social media campaign really kicked off, they quickly rose to about 100,000 Facebook followers and has a significant presence on YouTube as well, where their videos come out about 4 to 6 times per week and are well over 100 million views at this point, which is nothing to sneeze at when you figure that there's only about 4.5 million Jains in the world. So what is the SRMD building and how are they building it? So I'm positing that they're creating what I'm calling a globalized Jain public. Right? And this largely builds on Raja Chandra's independence as a layman guru who has no mendicant lineage or affiliation. It's ecumenical in its orientation, drawing widely from Jain and Hindu religious traditions and texts. In fact, just this morning, I got in my WhatsApp group that Rakesh Bhai will be doing a discourse on the Bhagavad Gita on March 1st. Tune in. But it goes beyond Raja Chandra's sort of spiritualist discourse by bringing ritual performances back in. So they have a temple that was actually just commissioned on the grounds of their ashram in Dharampur. And we'll get a lot of what we'll look at now is kind of a kind of discourse of self-help and well-being that has come into his kind of pitch. This self-improvement focus, I argue, eschews community formation patterns and practices that really form the hallmarks of those monastic lineages, alignments with specific caste communities. And instead, Rakesh Bhai links individualized self-improvement to cosmopolitan class interests in identity or heritage, especially for diaspora Jain youths, and well-being, especially spiritual and bodily health. So we see a lot about how to control one's anger, how to do yoga on the go, and are particularly interested in setting up a series of charities, which they do under the Srimad Rajchandra Love and Care mission. So they have a number of hospitals, rural schools in India. And that ashram-based work or seva is very much a part of the practice of being involved with the SRMD, which is pretty new for Jains. Jains have not always been so big on seva, a few organizations aside. And one of the things that it really reaches out to is that it's putting itself on par with other national level and kind of international level gurus like Sadhguru, whom Deepa mentioned earlier. So what we see are, especially on Instagram, these are a couple of the kind of graphics that they put up on a daily basis. So we have here on the right a series called #Sadhguru Whispers. that offer us little snippets of happiness, well-being, and spirituality. We get little aphorisms from the guru here. And on the left side, we see a YouTube series that was advertised about how to deal with and manage stress. So this is very much speaking to a kind of white collar audience that are trying to find ways that Jain principles or even Indic religious or spiritual principles can help them deal with their lives sort of as cogs in the capitalist wheel. In particular, they launched a series of Instagram TV videos, and I'll just play for you a part of one of those here. This is by Dr. Munsi Shah, who's from Phoenix, Arizona, who's talking about her experience doing puja for the first time after having it explained. Let's see if I can unmute this here.
So actually, before meeting Puja Gurudev Shri, Snatra Puja was something.
I think I have to switch my share over here, sorry.
So actually, before meeting Puja Gurudev Shri, Snatra Puja was something we used to enjoy, but quite frankly speaking, I didn't actually know what I was doing, why I was singing, why I was doing Pakshal. I didn't understand exactly what was happening. It was nice, but that was it. I didn't come out feeling so elevated. But after meeting Puja Gurudev Shri, Snatra Puja during Paryushan time is something every single one of us look forward to. We actually wake up early and we're so excited to go for Snatra Puja. All
right, I'll cut it off there. But what you get a sense of from that video is that this is really very much appealing to a kind of an individualized reason why one does ritual, right? Whereas before, the rituals tended to be kind of community performances and about kind of the reproduction of the Jain community, especially through temple ritual. But right, the thing that often you hear, especially younger Jains who live in the US and UK talk about, is they don't know why they're doing it, and their parents often didn't know how to explain it to them, which is frequently what I'm asked to do, things I rarely want to weigh in on. But what we see here is a real kind of appeal to a new sort of cultivation of an individualized spirituality. And Rakesh Bhai is largely taking from other national level gurus like Sadhguru here. This is a picture of him taken at the 2019 Jaina convention that was held in Los Angeles, who at the time was putting out a series of videos about how to sort of deal with stress, about how to work with sort of bodily cleanse, and also engaging with the World Economic Forum. And so Rakesh Bhai is very much modeling himself after figures like Sadhguru and a number of others. And very prominently also the Swami Narayans are sort of a big kind of template for how he's organizing his ashram as well. So a couple of theorists have been really helpful to me so far as I start to think about like what kind of spirituality is being developed here. And one of them is Andrea Jain, whose new book, Peace, Love, Yoga, has looked specifically at what she calls kind of neoliberal religion. And then also Castells, who's talking about mass self-communication. And one of the points that Jain makes is that in sort of the neoliberal capitalist market, identity or religious identity specifically becomes a matter of what groups and individuals can assert in the open marketplace. And I think what we're seeing here very much so with the online kind of social media campaign is a case of sort of building it and they will come. In that Rakesh Bhai's reputation, his title, and everything is really being built on these social media platforms so that the goal is to try to attract people to come to the ashram, I guess in some ways to buy the things that he's putting out, like books and pamphlets and other objects like that, but really to kind of build a new sensibility about what Jain spirituality is. And so he's engaging through sort of creating a personal brand online to try to cultivate himself, but also in the process to create a new kind of class-based spirituality. It's also deeply nationalistic. Of course, Prime Minister Narendra Modi famously attended the unveiling of that 34-foot statue of Srimad Raj Chandra that's on the grounds of the Dharampur Mission Ashram that I started off this presentation with. And so this also is linking to a vision for upper caste and upper class Jains who really want to see kind of the new mode, the new India as kind of part and parcel of their spirituality as well. right? And so in some ways, if we follow what Andrea Jane's saying, that what is really being produced here by the Dharampur mission is in fact a new kind of identity. And that this is especially helping diaspora Jain youth to kind of connect with their Jain roots. But this is a case in which we're seeing, or as Jane points out, very much a transnational kind of community forming here among upper class and sort of cosmopolitan Jains in India, as well as in the diaspora. And so what we're looking here at, I think, is very much what she's talking about with a kind of hyper-individualism and a getting away from the Jain soteriology and even away from the Jain community, and seeking what she calls freedom over liberation in terms of kind of self-cultivation. And so a self-perfection here that is not moksha-oriented, but sort of seems to be about kind of elevating the self. And we're starting to see that with some of the more recent things that are coming out of their Instagram campaign, whereas I'm fairly sure this picture was taken from a study abroad poster. But what we're seeing here is very much an appeal to an international Jain youth to go to India to find oneself. This is also linking to certain kinds of liberal causes about things like pluralism, equity, environmentalism, right? As it's put in
I'm sorry, we have to wrap it up.
Oh, okay, sure.
Thanks.
And as I say, social upliftment. And it frequently sort of shies away from engaging in kind of moralizing agendas, right? So it's really being done on sort of an individualized gestural level, as Jane calls it. And so, yeah, we see this as a recent post from their Instagram thing. So, right, this are sort of Jain youth handing out rotis to people on the street, which is sort of shocking and appalling in its own way. And so, so what I'm positing here is that we are looking at the formation of what I'm calling not so much a new sect of Jainism, but a new kind of class-based transnational Jain public. So on one hand, the SRMD is creating a sect. Surely they actually have their own class of renouncers and things like that. What it's actually doing is starting to split off on a class basis, sort of who the Jain public are. And this particularly is kind of galvanizing Jains who see Jainism as an individualized path of spirituality and also service and sort of charity that is being done kind of as a matter of one's own self-cultivation. So yeah, look forward to your comments, and sorry if I've gone over time here. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. We just we want to make sure that everyone has a chance to thank you all to ask their questions. And for our webinar audience, please write your questions into the question and answer section. I'll open the floor first for panelists to ask each other questions before we go to the listening audience. So would anyone from the speakers like to address a question to another panelist in order to start discussion?
Actually, I had a question for Shirali.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I was really intrigued by this debate here, and I was kind of wondering, like, what is the tone of some of these polemical texts that, as far as you can detect? Are they kind of ironic? Are they being humorous, tongue-in-cheek? Are they being very earnest? I'm just sort of wondering, like, what is their relationship between sort of the modern scientific discourse and the religious aspect of it?
Sure, thank you.
Can I add a quick note to that? Do you also have any perspectives that were recorded by either the British or the Swami Dayanand's side? I was curious if there's multiple views of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much to both Stephen and Anna, and thank you to all the panelists for really exciting papers that I learned a lot from. So to answer your question, Stephen, the tone operates in multiple registers, and what I'm basing my analysis on is different fragments from the hagiographic tradition associated with this Muslim scholar and the institution that he's a part of. But even in that kind of hagiographic celebration, this kind of a triumphalist victory, there are moments of fissure that we certainly find there. So, since I was focusing on one very specific part of this, but there are moments, for example, when Qasim Nanotwi himself entertains the possibility that the whole question of were prophets ever sent to India or not? And he does entertain the possibility that, the prophets that go unmentioned in the Quran, they may well have been sent to India. And he actually goes through a rise and fall history of Hinduism itself by saying that, these Hindu prophets had been very pure and uncorrupted, and it's really the later Hindus themselves who have associated different sort of stories like Rama's divinization and Krishna's stealing of the butter and Radha's relationship, etc. So it's an interesting way in which interreligious comparative evaluation also takes place in a certain charitable register, but certainly has that kind of a tone. Or, for example, we learn of the moment when, in fact, once they were sitting alone in a tent, Nanotwi does proselytization to the Christian missionary, Father Knowles, and tells him about the virtues of Islam, and he listens very patiently and says, "Thank you so much for considering of my welfare. I will ponder over it and get back to you." So there are those kinds of moments. Or when he was passing through the streets of Shahjahanpur after the polemic, the Hindu shop owners were saying that this is an avatar that has come in the shape of Nanotwi. So, on the one hand, there is this kind of a triumphalist, kind of a cutting register of trying to establish the superiority of one tradition over the other. And that register, of course, is quite consistent. But then there are also these registers when you see these intimacies of human encounters and these kinds of fissures and inconsistencies also revealing some cracks in the narrative that also reveal, even in the Muslim historiography, for that matter. And to answer Anna's question, yes, there is a counter narrative that I have not considered. So that is one of the limitations right now. But I do believe that there are narratives in Hindi, Arya Samaj narratives, that in fact Barton Scott at the University of Toronto is looking at in his new project on sort of a South Asian history of blasphemy that he's doing. So he's looking at the Arya Samaj side of it. But my focus has been on the Muslim historiography. But there are 3 different versions of it, and with different dates as well, which makes it interesting.
If I could, I had a question for Ram, and that is that this idea of the knowledge of personal experience seems to me to be really crucial for other subaltern groups as well. In my own observation of Muslim feminists, for instance, or queer Muslim writers, this idea of the spiritual knowledge that one gets from one's own embodied personal experience is a key concept. I'm thinking here of Sadia Sheikh's work on interpreting the Quran through personal experience. So I'm wondering if that's a larger theme that you might see running through other subaltern groups who are speaking back to power hierarchies, as in the case of your Dalit poet activists.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. That's a great question. And I want to kind of relate this also to what Anna was talking about in the context of the Malerkotla Sikhs, that they have this, and the way in which the Sikh religiosity and, so there's this sense, I think you can also see that in this idea of love that Deepa was talking about in her presentation among a certain group of people. And which there is this group of what you call subaltern and what I call Dalit, tribal, and other groups who are trying to kind of, draw from, I think, this genealogy of poet saints who have been able to criticize caste and hierarchy and also distinguish themselves from Vaishnavism and Vaishnava religion. So I think it's something. I think to my sense, the source of this are the teachings, the inherited teachings of Raidas, Kabir, and other hagiographies that you find produced by Anantadasa and Nabadas and other group. And I think what I'm trying to do in my work is also, it will be interesting to see how this relates to tribal, but you can see a strong connection with Sikhism here, the way in which Anna was talking about. And you can see some connection with parts of Jainism, but I think what happens with Jainism, it moves strongly to Vaishnavism. It's really embedded in Vaishnavism, whereas this, Sikhism, or for instance, Raidas movement in North India is really trying to separate itself, has tried to separate itself from. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't have other material from tribal groups. A part of it may have, let me stop there and invite other people for conversation.
Okay, a question has come in from the audience from Rutika. This is directed toward Deepa. It says, thank you for your talk. Could you talk more about the point you made about Amma and her marketing strategy that focuses on social capital versus human connections? The questioner said, this seems interesting, perhaps a paradox, because she's known as the hugging guru.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. It's actually really great. And also, I really appreciate being on this panel. I feel like I learned so much and actually made some good connections with my own work. So I really appreciated everyone's comments. So to that question, I didn't really get a chance to get into it, but so the image I showed of her in the that first sort of image of her like this is of course her hugging pose. A lot of her social networking is really focused on taking what she does live and putting it into various virtual spaces. So that's one aspect of it. She also has the sheer number of followers that you see are mainly people who have attended her events, but really end up connecting with her through the community. And I didn't say this before either, but one of the interesting things about Amma is the number of much like Ramdev and Sadhguru and some of these other transnational gurus, you see a lot of satellite accounts that are started by fans, right? They're just like fan pages we would see for like a music band. But that's where you see the real digital networking happening. And those are where a lot of these events are happening. So it does seem counterintuitive, but what I think she does a really nice job of, and it's very different than say Ramdev, is she's really marketing herself as a hugger, as someone who is promoting love. So everything she puts out there is always a picture of her smile and her hug. And it's very much a visual representation of what she's doing in terms of hugging. Where with Ramdev, you're seeing him put himself out there to really just sell those products that he has on his website. So it's like a little bit different type of thing. She's really using herself and her self-image as a hugger to sort of build these networks. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, I think so. A question has come in for everybody on the panel from Supriya, saying, and especially directed toward Steve and Deepa, maybe you could briefly address the relationship, if any, between new devotional publics that you analyze and that of political bhakti and Modi's devotional public.
Want to go first, Deepa?
Certainly there are a lot of overlaps, and there's a lot of overlap even between Steve and I's research in this area, actually very much brought to the fore by a recent article that was talking about how Jain and Hindu groups are both banding together. Thanks, Rohit, for the share, to sort of, revamp Qutub Minar, right? So Steve sees a lot of overlap as well, I think, and I'll let him talk about that. But I definitely think that when we talk about this political bhakti, what I look at is sort of looking at accounts that post those kinds of posts, and then what other posts that they're posting. So these are definitely posting the same sorts of things about, for example, you'll see a post about Narasinga Anand on the same account as you'll see a post about Modi, as the same account as you'll see a post about Yogi. So you can see that network, right? And then you'll also see who they're sharing, right? There's a lot of what I call cross-pollination, cross-pollination between social media, spaces. And one last thing I'll say is that one of the things that I find is that different spaces, cater to different groups. So the kinds of things you're seeing on TikTok are going to be different than the things you're seeing on Facebook versus Twitter versus Instagram. But we're starting to see the ecosystem share between those networks, which means that there's being connections made between different demographics, different regions, right? In ways that are really interesting, and also sort of trumping the algorithms of social media networks, which operate right, according to region. So things trend regionally, right? But when you start to see that kind of sharing, you're sort of, changing the way the algorithm is going to operate. And it's going to create different kinds of networks and communities that may not have been possible before.
Thank you, Deepa. Steve, did you want to address that same question?
Yeah, just, very briefly, one of the things that I've found really fascinating about sort of Rakesh Bhai and the SRMD's general strategy overall is to talk about sort of charity as fixing problems, but never actually ever discussing sort of why those problems exist in the first place. It's very close to Modi, but they're very distant from the CAA or NRC, like they never tweeted about any of those issues. And so, it seems to me like it's really a sort of about Jain youth, especially sort of appealing to Modi as a kind of an icon of growth and development for a new India. And I would say, especially a lot of the Jain youth that I know who are really into Rakesh Bhai get a sort of want to portray India as a sort of like shining glass, clean, beautiful city, and like get really annoyed when you want to talk about any kind of social problems or issues, or especially how politics may be exacerbating that. So it's sort of this careful dance between sort of seeing Modi as an icon of India's growth and never actually addressing the reason why any of those social issues exist, where they want to like sort of exact their charity service. That's why I call it sort of hyper individualized.
So an erasure of any discussion of structural violence or inequalities.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Harjeet had a question. You want to ask it on video? Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi there. Thanks everyone for the amazing talks. I wanted to just focus on the one talk by Ram Narayan for a minute, if I could, and maybe there's other people who can comment on this as well. But you were looking at the commentaries kind of in the early 1900s. And I found it really, one part that was really interesting to me was the way that they're conceptualizing things, but in terms specifically about the Anubhav and Anubhav Gyan, I was interested in kind of, you guys were just mentioning this in correlations with the Sikh tradition, but in the early 1900s, and I mentioned this before, but you have a lot of people in the Sikh tradition trying to focus on self-cultivation, and it sounds like they're getting a lot of signals about that, new reading practices and stuff from British interlocutors like Macauliffe, Ernest Trump, other people who they clearly admire. You can see that in Professor Gurmukh Singh's introduction to the Hafizabad Wali Janam Sakhi, for instance. Pai Veer Singh, in his introduction to Prathan Janam Sakhi, also mentions this. And if you read the pamphlet literature, there's also kind of exhortations to, kind of connected to what Sher Ali was talking about, be more historicizing, like the Muslims have been. So there seems to be a turn towards kind of historicization, which I think is intimately connected to ideas and principles of self-cultivation that are connected to romanticism in kind of European traditions and kind of conversations that are going on in Europe and coming in. Do you notice, Ram Narayan ji, that there are interventions, new things happening in these decades in the early 1900s, or is this a continuity of things that were happening earlier in relation to interpretations of Raidas and Kabir?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And a couple of things. What I'll say here is that, so, what is interesting about this, dozen Dalit poet activists, they are literate. They come from primarily from an oral tradition where they've gone to maybe middle school. So, for example, Achyutanand went to middle school, the government middle school, and then that was his. So they're reading material that they learn in the government schools. Okay, so that's where the history comes in. That this new sensibility is building among them. That but on the other thing, what I've tried to emphasize in my work is actually. I think the fact that so what I have is around 40 song booklets produced by Aadhi Hindu Mahasabha Press, and there are a number of other booklets that has been published by Dalit groups. So total around 60 or 80 books. All of them are in verse, in songs. So they're not prose, right? But all of them are addressing the question of politics centrally. They're all talking about they're all addressing the question of representation in the context of 1919 reforms. they're talking about the question of right and justice and dignity, but they're all using verse. There's speeches which are in prose, but all of it is in. So that tells that, so the educational background, the context in which they're. The term I use is I call them Dalit literate public, in the sense that their education is primarily primary school, maybe middle school, but they're extremely invested in, they started press, so they're extremely invested in publication, investment, but the mode of communication, because of their, most of them are first generation literate, their primary source of interaction is through verse and songs. And that's where, for example, Achyutanand grows up in a family where they're constantly listening to bhajans of Kabir and Raidas, and they're all familiar with Sikhism, and he goes. So I think this cultural milieu to me, is equally important. So I don't just foreground the British, because what happens when we foreground with the British is we take the agency away from the groups, subaltern groups, to use, that they are, what are their sources of motivation and where they're coming from. So of course, the colonial context is important, but it allows these groups to kind of open up a number of debate. And to me, what is important is that they're using songs, verse, which suggests a longer relationship with the Sant Mat tradition of the bhajan. It's not so. Let me try to rephrase it. It suggests a relationship with so fortnightly singing of these poets saying songs, which are critical about caste and hierarchy, which are trying to engage with a certain set of practices that are distinct from Vaishnava Hinduism. So that's what I'm trying to. So I am aware that yes, the British context is important, but I think I don't want to get caught in that because what happens in the agency of the subalterns, as we know, with some of the studies that get lost. We all talk about colonial state.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know whether I answered your question, but
that was perfect. Question. Yeah, thank you.
The organizers have been very gracious to give us about 7 more minutes of question time. And I'd like to channel a question that's come in from Purnima. This is directed toward Anna, but maybe it might resonate with the experience of others. So please speak up. She writes, the Mallarkotla case seems to be distinctive in not engaging more banal notions of love or spirituality, but more specifically to direct acts of public and intersectional solidarity. So the question is, how do residents of Mallarkotla engage or disengage with the likely trolling, hate mongering, and polemics that are a regular feature of everyday life, as our other panelists have described? So Anna, this is a question for you, but through you to your interlocutors there in Mallarkotla. Have they talked to you about dealing with such experiences of trolling or hate, whether that's personal or digital, I guess the question is.
Thank you for that, Purnima. And certainly it happens. People are, anybody who's on Facebook or any of these other platforms does get comments, or on Twitter, often very generic, possibly bot produced commentaries about how Muslims are untrustworthy and so on and so forth. For the most part, people simply brush this off and continue to do the work. I mean, at least that's the bulk of the folks that I am in contact with. It's just this constant effort that all you can do is meet the criticism with the work. Essentially, you just continue to go to the to the Gurdwara and help to make langar for impoverished people or people in need. You just keep doing all of these gestures in very public and explicit ways and framing them constantly. I mean, again, it's like anything that is done that involves any form of interreligious interaction is always framed again as being part of this shared ethos, as being in the spirit of Guru Gobind Singh's blessings after the Hadhanara that he gave to the town, and in the spirit of the Sufi saint who founded the town. So there's multiple routes into this discourse, and it becomes like a sort of protective barrier that people sort of wield almost as a shield against this kind of trolling. And I've actually been surprised in looking at news media reports at how little negative commentary appears in the comments under videos and other news essays about Malerkotla. It's kind of surprising how, I mean, it's there, but it's by far not the majority. Mostly you get perhaps a self-selecting public that really wants, is very thirsty for this kind of, if perhaps exaggerated vision, but still a needed one. So thanks for that.
Can I also join? So Anna raised a question. Anna, so I think Malerkotla is really quite an interesting example, and this may be just for other people as well. My question about, but clearly it foregrounds the certain elements of ethical commitments to certain practices and to certain principles that are, again, I'm speculating here, but are uniquely kind of, what I've been calling Atmanubhav Gyan, what the Sant Mat calls. So they're really aware of the social condition in which they have lived for generations in Malerkotla. And so I wonder, and this again, I'm trying to speculate here that there's this unique connection between the religion of Raidas and Santmat and Ravidasya and Sikhism here that is offering us a slightly different understanding of context, a way distinct from, I would say, Vaishnava Hinduism, where, now again, I'm really making big general comments here, but I'm trying to think through here, like how do we account to this commitment in Malerkotla, which is, we can offer a secular narrative, but we can also look at the role of ethical commitments here and values. So I don't know.
Yeah, thank you for that. I agree. I think there's a lot of resonance across many religious formations, not just in Punjab, but of course Punjab has its own particular sort of, less Brahmanical sort of influences historically, at least, though it's not absent, of course. And then there's, one of the things that I observed during my earlier research, of course, was a lot of people citing the sense that, of sort of a universal mutual minority status, that everybody has a sense of solidarity because everybody is a minority in a certain regard, whether through caste or class or larger religious formations. And so because of that, even the local Hindus and the large presence of Namdari Sikhs and other communities that are not they're not majoritarian even within their own communities. And so that sort of sense of mutual solidarity was pointed to by many people as like, we all kind of understand each other, right? We have a shared self location within Punjab in particular, but within India more broadly. And so I think that allows people to resonate across these like ethical concepts that resonate across religious formations in really strong ways. And again, the constant effort to remind people of that. There's no public, political rally where the Hadhanara is not mentioned. There's no public political rally where, the foundation by the Sufi saint is not mentioned. And the sort of, so it's just like a drumbeat, in a sense that people who want to push back against that are themselves censured from within the community. And so people who try to, create these divisions find themselves very swiftly corrected, often from within their own communities by the leaderships within the town. So again, it's like, I think it's a mistake to regard it as utopian because it's actually a lot of work that people are putting into making this happen.
All right. We are having to wrap up, although these questions are open-ended, and I'm sure that we could go on for a very long time thinking about how new solidarities and new communities are formed, reformed, reinforced, sometimes through new technologies. So thank you to all the presenters, especially those who brought out the digital component, of forming new communities or new networks of discourse. That is certainly what's driving the current situation. And it's good to dwell on that. I thank you all. And I hand the microphone, whatever it is, back to Rohit to maybe close us out for this amazing event. Rohit, are you with us?
Yes. Sorry. Thanks very much, Scott, and thanks to all the panelists. And thanks to everyone involved in the conference. I have too many people to thank individually, and I will get to that by email. But, I just want to start by saying I'll keep my comments short. I know it's Friday afternoon, evening in some places, that for me, this was an absolute joy to immerse myself in this scholarship for 2 days and just listen. One, because I sort of dwell in the suburbs of South Asian studies, more in media and communication studies. So that's one reason. But also, I spend a significant amount of my time on parking lot redevelopment committee, library lighting committee, university committees. But to participate in, that kind of service work, to get to hear and be part of and listen to these scholars, this is a reminder and an embodiment of, why one did this in the first place. So in terms of substantive ideas, I could just get into so many conversations. One of the things I just want to end with 2-3 more thoughts. One of the things that really stood out to me, along with the formidable intellectual firepower, one theme that ran through, I think, pretty much all the papers and panels was this notion of dangerous knowledge. Knowledge that is dangerous and knowledge that disrupts, to use, Silicon Valley jargon. And if you look at, just knowing what's been happening in South Asia, and scholars who work on South Asia and religion, their knowledge is also seen as dangerous knowledge. That's the situation they're in. But it's very heartening to me to see that this tradition of questioning, of interrogation, which can be rooted back, anchored back in different intellectual traditions from South Asia, is so robust and strong. So I hope that we will, continue to produce work that qualifies, among other things, as this kind of dangerous knowledge. And if we think of this moment right now in the conference as an end, I'm reminded of, or a boundary, I'm reminded of Heidegger's observation that a boundary is not a closing, it is a beginning. It opens a space out, a clearing in which new objects are revealed and new things have to be discovered. And I think we have found many new lines of inquiry, new connections, new areas to be mined. Of course, speaking of knowledge, I should just say that dangerous knowledge and other kinds of knowledge, that the knowledge of the Hindu right online seems to be restricted to one author, which is Will Durant. So I just had to make that observation. I think I've earned one crack at them. So yes, if there is, and a final thought, I think that if one can say there is something close to a common South Asian religion, it would be tea, perhaps. So I hope that the next time we meet, in whatever permutations and combinations, we are able to meet in person over endless cups of tea and carry on these conversations. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.